He walked into the room with only one arm, but his presence filled the space like a thunderclap. He had every reason to be bitter, betrayed, wounded, forgotten. But what he did next will leave you speechless. This is not just a story about war, loss, or heartbreak. This is a story about strength, forgiveness, and what it really means to come home. The soldier returns, with one arm but a whole heart. John stepped off the bus, the familiar sights of his hometown greeting him. Yet everything felt different. The left sleeve of his uniform hung empty, a silent testament to the battles he'd fought and the sacrifices he'd made. Children stared, their eyes wide with curiosity and confusion. Old friends offered hesitant smiles, unsure of what to say or how to act. The war had ended for many, but for John, it was still very much alive. He didn't return to fanfare or parades. There were no medals waiting to be penned, no speeches celebrating his bravery. Instead, there was silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that spoke volumes. Inside, John carried a storm of emotions. Pain from his injuries, memories of fallen comrades, and questions that had no answers. Yet, amidst the turmoil, his heart remained steadfast. He still loved his country, despite the scars it had given him. He still loved the woman he hoped was waiting for him, the one whose letters had been his lifeline during the darkest days. And he still loved life, even if it looked different now. As he walked through the town, memories flooded back, playing catch in the park, Sunday dinners with family, first kisses under the stars. Each step was a reminder of what he'd lost and what he still had. John knew the road ahead would be challenging. There would be physical therapy, moments of doubt, and days and the weight of it all felt unbearable. But he also knew he wasn't alone. The community, though unsure, cared. The children who stared would learn to understand. The friends who hesitated would find their words. And the woman he loved, he hoped she would see past the missing arm and into the heart that beat for her. This was just the beginning of a new journey, one of healing, rediscovery, and redefining what it meant to be whole. Memories of war, explosions, loss, and survival. The desert was endless. John remembered the heat, the silence between gunfire, and the sound of his heartbeat in moments of sheer fear. War wasn't like the movies. There were no heroic soundtracks, no slow-motion hero shots, just dust, dread, and decisions that could end lives in a blink. He was stationed deep in hostile territory. Days blurred into nights. The ground beneath his boots was never stable. Every step could be his last. And yet, amidst the danger, there was something else. Brotherhood. His squad became his second family. They shared jokes, meals, memories. They knew each other's fears, birthdays, and the names of their childhood dogs. That kind of bond is forged only in fire. Then came that day. The explosion wasn't loud at first. It was distant, more like a thud. But the force knocked him back, and when he opened his eyes, his world was red. Blood, dirt, pain. He looked down and saw nothing where his left arm used to be. Everything after that was chaos. Screams, smoke, hands trying to stop the bleeding. Someone yelled, "We've got you," but John felt nothing. No pain, just weightlessness and a sudden wave of sorrow. He didn't cry because of the pain. He cried because in that moment he thought of home. He thought of dancing with his wife. He thought of tossing a ball to a child he hadn't even met yet. He thought of holding a hand with two hands, and now one of them was gone. Survival wasn't just about the body. It was about the will to keep going. Recovery was worse than the battlefield. Skin grafts, phantom limb pain, nightmares. He would wake up sweating, convinced his squad was calling for help, only to realize he was alone in a hospital bed. But it was also in that hospital where he met others, some without legs, some without sight, who reminded him, "You're still here, and that means something." That memory of survival became his compass, not because he lived, but because he chose to keep living. 3 weeks into the hospital, John stopped counting the days. The walls were white, the food was bland, and the nights were long. Pain came and went, but emptiness stayed. What haunted him most wasn't the missing arm. It was the missing purpose. Until one morning, a nurse handed him a small envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable, slanted, graceful. Her letters always smelled faintly of lavender. It was from her. His fingers trembled. He stared at the envelope for minutes before opening it, as if afraid the words might shatter him. "Dear John, I don't know how to begin. Every day I've prayed that you'd come back, alive, breathing, whole. And when I heard, I cried. First from joy, then from guilt. I know you've been through hell, and I know my words might not be enough. But if you're reading this, it means you survived, and that alone is a miracle." John stopped reading. Tears blurred the words. The letter went on, simple, honest. She told him about the garden, about the dog, about the new neighbors, and the way their daughter reminded her of him when he was young. There was no mention of the war, or the injury, or the things they couldn't change. Only love, in small sentences. In the way she signed off, "You are still the bravest man I know, and I still love you, always, Emily." It wasn't a declaration. It was a lifeline. That letter stayed under John's pillow for months. He read it every night like a prayer. In a world where everything had changed, her words reminded him that some things still remain, and in that fragile hope, he found his first reason to believe again. The wound on his body wasn't as deep as the one in his heart. The second letter came a month later. John recognized the handwriting immediately. His heart leapt, but something in the envelope felt heavier. Not in weight, in silence. He opened it slowly, cautiously, like peeling a bandage from a fresh wound. "John, there's something I've been afraid to tell you." He paused. The air around him froze. He kept reading. "I waited. For years I waited with every ounce of hope, but there came a day when I thought I had lost you forever. I wasn't strong, John. I tried. I promise I tried. But one winter, after the letters stopped coming, I broke. She had met someone, not out of love, but out of loneliness. A neighbor, kind, gentle, who helped her shovel the snow and fix a leaky roof. He listened when she cried. He was there when the world felt empty. I never stopped loving you, but I stopped believing you'd come back." John put the letter down, his breath shallow. His heart felt like it had lost a second limb. The pain of losing an arm had a name, a reason, a moment in time. This pain was endless. He thought of all the nights in the hospital, reading her first letter, how it had carried him through, how he'd whispered her name, and the nightmares came, how he'd imagined seeing her again, holding her close even with just one arm. And now he felt like a stranger to his own life, but something inside him whispered, She told the truth, and in a world where pain ruled truth, even painful truth was still sacred. He didn't scream. He didn't curse her name. He folded the letter, pressed it to his chest, and sat in silence, because that silence was kinder than hate. The confession that shattered everything. I'm sorry. I couldn't wait anymore. It wasn't just a letter this time. It was a visit. Emily came. In person. John saw her through the window, standing there, holding her coat close to her chest like a shield. She hadn't changed much. Same hair pulled into a soft bun, same nervous smile, but something in her eyes was different, older, tired, and sure. He opened the door. "Hi," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hi," he replied, stepping aside. They sat at the small wooden table in the center of the room, the same table where he had eaten hospital meals alone for months. "I needed to see you," she began. "I couldn't keep writing like that. It wasn't fair." He nodded. Words didn't come easily anymore. She looked down at her hands, twisting a small ring. "I wanted to be stronger, John. I wanted to wait forever. I swore I would, but years passed, and silence hurts more than death." John stared at her, not with anger, but with an ache so deep it felt hollow. "I used to write to you every week, even when I heard nothing back. I believed, but one day I stopped believing, and I hated myself for it." She started to cry. "I never stopped loving you, but I also couldn't keep living like a widow without a grave." The words hung heavy in the air. She didn't defend her actions. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply told the truth, and that truth broke him more than the battlefield ever did. But then something strange happened. He reached across the table with his one remaining hand and held hers. "It's okay," he said, because somewhere between the blood, the pain, and the silence, John had learned something important. Love isn't always about holding on. Sometimes it's about letting go. The final embrace, and silence in place of blame. They stood in the doorway, where light spilled across the wooden floor. Neither of them moved for a long time. John could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. He wondered if time itself was holding its breath with them. Emily wiped her tears and whispered, "I should go," but she didn't. Not yet. John stepped closer, slowly, not out of anger or longing, but out of something deeper. Closure. He raised his one arm, hesitantly at first. She understood without words and stepped into it. They embraced, not tightly, not desperately, just enough to say everything that had no words, enough to feel the years that had passed and the space they now filled with acceptance. Her face pressed gently against his shoulder. He could feel the quiet sobs in her breath. He closed his eyes, not to escape, but to feel her presence more fully. There were no speeches, no confessions, no what-ifs, just two people, two hearts, one goodbye. When they pulled apart, she looked into his eyes one last time. "You've always been the strongest man I've ever known." John nodded, smiling softly, not because it didn't hurt, but because he'd finally made peace with the pain. "I'll be okay," he said, and he meant it. She walked away, and he didn't stop her, because the silence they left behind was more powerful than any farewell. Rebirth, from pain to a journey of healing. The day after Emily left, John sat by the window for hours. The world outside moved on, children played, leaves danced, the sun rose and fell. But inside, something had shifted, something that used to ache now felt hollow. But in that emptiness, there was space for something new. He started walking, just around the block at first. The cold wind hurt his lungs, but it felt good to move. Each step reminded him, I'm still here. The neighborhood watched. Some waved, others just nodded. A few came up and said, thank you. Not for the war, but for surviving. He didn't know what healing looked like yet, but he knew it wasn't a straight line. It was a spiral, one that looped through sorrow, then strength, despair, then courage. John joined a local veterans group. At first, he just listened. Men told stories with broken voices. Some cried, some joked. All of them were looking for the same thing, a way to live again. One day, a man asked John to share his story. He hesitated, then stood. I lost an arm, he began, but I didn't realize how much more I lost until I came home. Silence. But I also found something I didn't expect. I found that pain doesn't mean the end. It just means something new is starting. From that day forward, John kept speaking at schools, churches, parks. His voice wasn't loud, but it was honest, and that made people listen. He began volunteering at hospitals, sitting beside new amputees. Sometimes he said nothing, just sat there. Presence was enough. He learned to write with his right hand. He painted again, slowly, dutifully. Pain became color, color became story, and story became healing. He was no longer just a man who returned from war. He was a man reborn from it. The soldier becomes a speaker, sharing his story with the world. It started with a high school auditorium. The principal had heard about John through the local Veterans Center. Would you mind talking to the students? He asked. Just a few words, nothing formal. John wasn't sure he was ready, but he said yes. That morning, standing behind the podium, looking out at rows of restless teenagers, John felt his hands tremble. He had no notes, no script, just a story. He began quietly. I lost an arm in the war. Some students looked up, others still tapped their phones. But that's not the story. He continued. The real story is what came after. He told them about the hospital, the silence, the pain, the letter, the goodbye. But more than that, he told them what he learned, that suffering doesn't end you. It refines you. By the end, the room was silent, not a forced silence, but one born from attention. Afterward, a girl approached him. She didn't say anything, just hugged him. That was when John knew his story wasn't his anymore. It belonged to everyone who needed it. From there, invitations poured in. Colleges, non-profits, military academies, even TEDx. He spoke in crowded halls and intimate classrooms. He was no longer nervous because he wasn't performing. He was offering truth. Everyone loses something in life, he'd say, but what you do after that's where you find who you are. He never talked like a hero. He talked like a human, and that's why people listened. One night, at a veterans fundraiser, a mother came to him. My son tried to end his life last year, she whispered, but he watched your talk online and he changed his mind. John felt his eyes sting. He realized he had become what he never thought he could be, a light in someone else's darkness. He wasn't a man with one arm anymore. He was a man with 1,000 voices echoing behind his own, the lesson of forgiveness and inner strength. People often asked John, how did you forgive her? How did you move on? How do you smile when you've lost so much? At first, he didn't know how to answer. Forgiveness didn't come in a moment. It wasn't a switch, it was a seed, one planted deep in broken ground, watered slowly by understanding and nurtured by time. John had every reason to be bitter. He'd lost an arm, a marriage, a version of his life he'd never get back, but he also gained something most people never find: peace. And peace, he learned, doesn't begin with answers. It begins with questions like, what am I holding on to? Is my anger helping me or hurting me? Do I want to be right or free? He realized that forgiveness wasn't about letting others off the hook. It was about letting himself go free from the weight of resentment. Inner strength wasn't about stoicism or pretending not to hurt. It was about facing the hurt and choosing not to let it define him. When he spoke to others, John always shared one moment: the night he cried not from pain but from release, the night he whispered to the dark, I forgive you, and I forgive myself. He told people, you don't need to forget to forgive. You just need to remember that you deserve peace. In that act of forgiveness, John didn't lose power. He reclaimed it, and in that inner strength, he discovered something more profound than victory. He discovered freedom. Final message: you don't need to be whole to live fully. When John walked on stage that evening, he wasn't nervous. He looked out at the audience not as a crowd, but as individuals, each person with their own story, their own invisible scars. He took a deep breath. I used to think that to live fully, I had to be whole, that I needed both arms, an unbroken life, a perfect story. He paused. But now I know that's not true. John pointed to his empty sleeve. Not with shame, but with peace. This doesn't define me. My scars, my past, my pain, they are part of me, yes, but they are not all of me. He leaned forward, his voice calm and steady. You don't need to have all the answers to move forward. You don't need to feel ready to take the next step. You just need to choose to keep going. His eyes scanned the room, locking eyes with a teenager in the front row, a mother in the back, an old man wiping tears. I've met people who have everything and still feel empty, and I've met people who have lost everything but radiate light. He smiled. So here's what I've learned. You don't need to be whole to be worthy. You don't need to be untouched to be strong. And you don't need to be perfect to be powerful. He stepped back. This world doesn't need more perfect people. It needs more real ones. And as he walked off stage, the standing ovation wasn't for a soldier. It was for a human being, flawed, broken, healing, and alive.